Okay, we're continuing where we left off. Before I start back in the paper, I just want to point out a couple texts to just as a reminder. Thus, this is Genesis 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God ended his work, which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work, which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he rested from all his work, which he, God, created and made. So sanctified means made holy. So we see that the seventh day is holy because God rested. It's his day. It's the day which can be said is the Lord's and is called such throughout the entire Old Testament, and I would argue into the New Testament. Why? Because it is the only day that Scripture calls that day that is the Lord's day. Thus, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, having made the Sabbath for man, not man for the Sabbath, and is therefore Lord of the Sabbath, which means he's demonstrating his deity per John 1, backing that up. Do you think John knew that Jesus claimed to be Lord of the Sabbath and what the implication was? Of course. So, because Jesus made everything and rested on that day, therefore, because he rested on it, historical fact, that day is holy. Now, if someone thinks that that's changed because, I don't know, they made it up, I'd like to ask you, how do you know that the day is no longer holy? How is that possible? It was made holy because God rested and declared holy. And last I checked, historical facts are facts. So every seventh day is holy because God rested. Okay. Them the facts, whether you like it or not. Okay, now let's look at this what was said about this when he codified the law of God, codified it. Not that it didn't exist before. See, because Joseph said committing adultery would be a sin against God before Sinai happened. Because committing adultery is bedrock morality. It's bedrock sin, and according to who God is. And we are who we are because God is who he is, and he made us in his image, see? For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, made it holy. So, there you have it. Notice it says this, but the seventh day, 6 days shalt you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. I think that's the same God, right? Yep, same God. Jesus didn't save us from the Old Testament God. He is the Old Testament God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your servants, not even your animals, not even the non-Israelite that is within your gates. The Sabbath was made for man, including servants, including non-Israelites that are strangers in your gate. What does that mean? It means the Sabbath is afforded for mankind, not for the Jews only. Because we're grafted in, remember, to the covenant. We're grafted into the new covenant established to the house of Israel. We're grafted in because it's the same God. And then we're grafted into their thing. And their thing says God has commandments, and those commandments are afforded to even the stranger within thy gates. So yes, business owners, you have to, lest it be a sin, offer the Sabbath of the Lord to your employees, even if they're not believers. Because everybody gets a day off. And you honor the Lord because he's the creator. And that creator is Jesus. Because you don't take the mark of the beast. Because that's what non-saved people do. People that are thrown into the lake of fire. And the third angel followed, saying with a loud voice, if any man worships the beast and his image, receives the mark in his forehead, his name, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God. Oh, but God, I mean, they didn't mean to worship the beast. They called the golden calf Yahweh. Isn't that good enough? Wasn't Cain's sacrifice sufficient? His fruits that he brought. I know you wanted him to bring the first of his flock, but you accepted his other sacrifice, right? Because it was still stuff he prized, right? He still called the calf Yahweh, didn't he? Isn't that good enough? The same shall drink of the wine of wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation, and will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. They have no rest. They have no rest. What? Who? The ones who worship the beast. Oh, rest? Is resting like a Sabbath or something? Like, because I rest in Jesus because he is my Sabbath? They worship the beast, not Jesus. So they have no rest, no Sabbath, no Jesus, day or night, because they worship not Jesus, Lord of the Sabbath. They worship the beast in his image. But here's the patience of the saints. Here's the ones that don't do that. They keep God's commandments and the faith of Jesus. Jesus is their Sabbath. Jesus is their rest. They worship Jesus. They followed the Lamb whithersoever he goes. We're redeemed from. Do you follow Jesus even to the Sabbath day? He kept the Sabbath. Worship him. Saying with a loud, fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth, and the sea and the fountains of water. What does that sound like? Sounds like worship the guy who is the creator. Sounds like the guy who, after 6 days, rested on the seventh day and hallowed it, making it holy. Way back at the very beginning, the first seventh day, before there was a Jew, or before Abraham was called, before he made a covenant, before man sinned, and he instituted sacrifices in Eden. Before that, he made the heavens, the earth, and the sea, and rested the seventh day. Worship him who made heaven, earth, the sea, and the fountains of water. Worship him. Is there a day of worship because it's holy, because he rested? I wonder. Let's look at one more verse before I start back in the thing, in the paper. Then they came to Jesus, the scribes and Pharisees, which were in Jerusalem, saying, why don't your disciples do the things that the elders taught us that you didn't say in the law? Why don't you do the things that the ecclesial authority has implemented as things you're supposed to do? How come your disciples don't do what the Father said to do, like we do? And Jesus said to them, why do you transgress God's commandments by your traditions? For God commanded, honor your father and mother, but you dishonor that. Thus, by taking a commandment that's listed in the 10 Commandments and flipped it on its head with your traditions, you have made the commandments of God of none effect by your tradition. You're a hypocrite. You were predicted by Isaiah, who made a prophecy saying, these people draw nigh to me with their mouths, and they say all kinds of wonderful things, but their heart is far from me. What do? they worship me in vain. How? They teach doctrines that men make up that are not the commandments of God. That's what they do. That's what they do. I'll just leave that up there. So one of the most thoughtful, ironic, and comprehensive reviews of Bacchiocchi's works comes from Andrew J. Banstra, now emeritus professor of New Testament theology at Calvin's Theological Seminary. He begins his review by noting that Bacchiocchi's book confronts the reader with one of the fundamental questions of New Testament theology. How much continuity is there between the Old and New Covenants? And in what sense is the New Covenant radically new? Before returning to this question, in his conclusion, Banstra examines the details of Bacchiocchi's thesis. There's much that he can agree with. In regards to the material on Christ and the Sabbath, he agrees with Bacchiocchi's basic approach. He agrees in the main with Bacchiocchi that the resurrection appearances could hardly have suggested a weekly commemoration of the resurrection. Certainly, 1 Corinthians 16:2 refers to a private setting, a site of funds, not to a Sunday worship activity. He agrees with Bacchiocchi that Acts 20:7 through 12 probably refers to a special meeting rather than an established weekly meeting. In his judgment, Acts 20:7 through 12 has no probative value for regular Sunday worship as a consistent practice of the New Testament church. He believes Bacchiocchi is correct in asserting that there is no evidence that the early Jerusalem church substituted Sunday for Saturday as the day of rest and worship. He feels that Bacchiocchi is correct in concluding that Acts 15 does not give proof that Sunday observance had been recognized by the entire apostolic church or that it had been adopted by the Pauline churches. He grants that Bacchiocchi is successful at challenging the oft-stated contention that in the New Testament, Sunday was more or less consistently substituted for Saturday as the Christian day of rest and worship. However, he has reservations regarding Bacchiocchi's treatment of the resurrection and the Lord's Supper. He suggests that John 20 may speak indirectly to the appropriateness of the first day of the week for an encounter with the risen Lord. Concerning the Lord's Day of Revelation 1:10, he believes that both the specific function of giving the time of the vision and the close connection with the risen and exalted one suggests that it should be understood either as Easter Sunday or more likely Sunday itself. The early church in Jerusalem recognized in its freedom in regard to the place and time for holding specifically Christian meetings. The early Jewish Christian church in Jerusalem insisted that the keeping of the Sabbath was not mandatory for the Gentile church. Where that is said, I don't know. The Acts 15 account does suggest that just as circumcision was not required of the Gentiles as a religious rite, so too the keeping of the Sabbath as the day of rest and worship for the Gentiles was not enjoined by the Jerusalem church. So Acts 15, they say they pick and choose what they want to take from the law of Moses, but the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments, no, that's, even though it's not said for or against in the text, I guess they can pick and choose a few things. And then, of course, none of these men who would say suggest such an absurd conclusion would say it's okay to break into the other 10 commandments, of course. So makes no sense. In the end, Banstra's opinion is that Bacchiocchi's thesis does not deal adequately with the concept of fulfillment as freedom to choose the place and time of worship. Towards the end of they just say keep the commandments of God, and that the saints keep the commandments of God, and that when they talk about the commandments in the New Testament, they list the 10 commandments, and Jesus says, pray your flight not come on the Sabbath day. But we can pick and choose and then just decide by whatever we feel like what is included in the 10 commandments. We can just omit some of them as we feel like it, even though the text says if you've broken one, you've broken them all when it quotes the 10 commandments. Because when they reference the commandments in the New Testament, they're not establishing them. This is a narrative, and we see them referencing the 10 commandments or referencing the law of Moses. They're references, not establishing what is or isn't part of the law. Because again, if you've broken one, you've broken them all. Men have no right to alter the law of God. When we see in the book of Revelation, the Ark of his Testament is seen in God's temple in heaven,
well after the the new covenant, the second covenant has been firmly established. So unless you think your declarations have allowed you access to the temple of God in heaven, where you can chisel out of the stone the things which were written on the stones and placed in the Ark of the Covenant found in the temple of God in heaven after the new covenant's been established, I would maybe rethink your ink. Well, Sunday observance is not explicitly enjoined or consistently practiced in the New Testament, the use of Sunday for worship is nonetheless something which is in harmony with the witness of the New Testament. Yeah, okay. Everybody's entitled to their opinions. Banstra feels that Bacchiocchi carefully considers the primary sources, shows remarkable familiarity with much secondary literature over a wide spectrum of theological scholarship, and gives competent analysis of the material considered. He finds that Bacchiocchi's treatment of the patristic text is helpful in describing the variety of factors at work in specifying Sunday as the uniquely Christian day of worship, and in some circles, the day of rest. So in other words, any evidence that people in the church early on reestablished a Sunday worship or whatever, he accepts that. So he accepts the guy at Calvin's Theological Seminary of Protestant superculture is very nice in his determinations of analyzing Bacchiocchi's work. And Mr. Protestant extraordinaire says the church has authority to change the commandments of God, rendering the Protestant Reformation and the foundation of breaking up the church because of corruption, because we stand on the word of God, not the word of men in the church, crumbles, and he's free falling helplessly because he's accepted the authority of the church over the word of God, which is unfortunate. Not long after Bacchiocchi's book was published, a group of scholars associated with the Tinsdale Fellowship for Biblical Research at Cambridge, previously covered by Bacchiocchi, Cambridge in England, issued a collaborative volume that covered some of the same ground previously covered by Bacchiocchi. While it deals more extensively with the Old Testament and later church history, the heart of the volume addresses the same issues that Bacchiocchi does, agreeing with some of his positions and challenging others. D.A. Carson's treatment of Jesus and the Sabbath fits this pattern. He agrees with Bacchiocchi that Jesus contravened the halakhic Sabbath without contravening the Torah concerning the Sabbath. He agrees that Bacchiocchi is right to protest against those commentators who insist that John intended by chapter 5, 17 through 28 to abolish the Sabbath. Yet he disagrees with some details of Bacchiocchi's interpretation of the disciples plucking grain. The suggestion that in this case Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees for failing to take Jesus and his disciples home for church on Sabbath, and is connecting the rest referred to in Matthew 11 with the Sabbath incident in Matthew 12. In one of his conclusions, he states, "There's no hint anywhere in the ministry of Jesus that the first day of the week is to take on the character of the Sabbath and replace it. However, the lordship of Jesus over the Sabbath is ultimate, and it is just possible that Jesus himself replaces the Sabbath." In the same volume, Max Turner discusses Sabbath and Sunday in Luke Acts. He questions Bacchiocchi's affirmation that Christ identified his mission with the Sabbath in order to make it a fitting memorial of his redemptive activity. He disagrees with the reasons that Bacchiocchi gives for his argument that Jesus' lordship over the Sabbath is grounded in his having made the day for man's benefit. That's what it says. In his opinion, the Son of Man has, perhaps, a permanent authority that transcends the law, and the institutions revealed therein. However, it is going too far to suggest that the Sabbath is abrogated and not even a glimmer of the dawn of the Lord's day is yet to be seen in the Lucan sky. End quote. On the other hand, Turner says Bacchiocchi's claim that the Sabbath is especially hallowed is barely more obvious. He agrees with Bacchiocchi that the resurrection narrative provides no hint that a new day was to be celebrated in honor of the risen Christ. In his concluding discussion on the material in Luke, Turner suggests that Luke's Jesus is continually subordinating the Sabbath to the demands of his own mission. Jesus presents the law as being fulfilled, but simultaneously being transcended in his teaching and ministry. As far as Acts is concerned, Turner disagrees with Bacchiocchi's argument that in Acts 15, James indicates a theological commitment to the law. In his opinion, the centrality of the law was displaced and it was not to be imposed on Gentiles, except for that parts of it are. Turner affirmed that there were many factors that would contribute to the continuity of Jewish Christians' seventh-day Sabbath observance, and he asserts that we have, as yet, found no firm evidence for the belief that the teaching of Christ had a significant effect on the pattern of Jewish Christian Sabbath observance. Remember now, this is the covenant I will make with them, as I'm speaking to the first covenant people about a future time when a Messiah will come and forgive their sins, which are transgressions of God's law. In that covenant, he'll forgive their sins, and then he'll put his law on their heart after forgiving their transgression of his law. And then we see the saints in heaven that keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. To the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this, there's no light in them. How easily people forget it when they're caught up in their own theological meanderings based on the traditions of men. Join me for the last part and an open discussion when it's put up on my channel. God bless.